It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to another Archaeodeath interview, and we are staying with the theme of interviewing experts and professionals with insights into the researching and public engagement of mortuary archaeology, archaeologies of memory. And this time I'm very excited to talk to John Swogger, archaeologist and illustrator. Hi, John.
Hello. Hi.
This is taking us into new directions here, and previous interviews I've talked with postgraduates and early career researchers, and we've got forthcoming interviews too that are going to be taking us around the world. And John, this interview is going to be looking at the UK, but also around the world, because John's been working all over the show in his career as an archaeologist and illustrator, and the synergy between the two. So, and the thing I want to get out of this interview is to ask John, what is the big question that we're gonna be addressing is sort of what is the role of of art in different media in our archaeological work. I think that's the big thing that I hope that this interview gives viewers a thought on and reflection on. So I want to start off, John, by welcoming you and thank you for doing this, and also to ask you to give viewers a little bit of your background. How did you get into archaeology, and what have you been doing in your career?
Right. Well, I guess my career has been very flexible, very scattershot in some respects, but it's all tied together through illustration. So I did archaeology at the University of Liverpool, archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean. I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I very much enjoyed it, but it was at the time when there were lots of jobs going in archaeology. It was the early 90s, PPG 16 had just come in, and there was lots of work around. And so I gravitated towards the work. And it was also at the time when illustration had not yet become as professionalized or as kind of set off from general archaeological practice as it perhaps is now. And so it was possible to be an archaeologist who illustrated without necessarily having to get any specific skills in the area apart from experience. So I demonstrated an aptitude for drawing pottery, and so was then, taken out of the trench and made to draw pottery. And then before I knew it, I was illustrating pottery catalogs and then lithics, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. And I think that's fairly typical, really, of the way that people ended up specializing in the early 90s. It wasn't necessarily a career decision. It was more led by whatever you happened to be interested in and the opportunities that presented themselves to you at the time. So I think it was kind of a bit of a surprise when I found myself described by other people as an archaeological illustrator. I hadn't really considered myself that. And I was doing some classes at the continuing education department at Liverpool, teaching archaeological illustration, teaching reconstruction illustration, and so on. And one of the students happened to go out to Chatelhuic as a volunteer. I can't remember exactly how they went out there, but as some kind of volunteer package for a summer jaunt. And she came back and said, "Oh, John, Ian Hodder is looking for an archaeological illustrator at Chatelhuic." And first of all, I didn't consider myself an archaeological illustrator, so I was a little bit surprised that I had been, I'd been picked out for this. And secondly, it never really occurred to me that this was the Chatelhuic, like the Chatelhuic of Melart and the Chatelhuic of, all those goddesses and all that kind of thing. And
so many of them banging around the Near East.
Funnily enough, I'd been doing some maps for the Liverpool University's Cognac Plain survey. And on it, there were two Chatelhuics marked, Chatelhuic East and Chatelhuic West. And it never really occurred to me that there was only one Chatelhuic with many, different sites, that it was maybe Chatelhuic was a common name in Anatolia. And so I phoned up Ian, he phoned me. And so we were chit-chatting, about this. And through the phone call, it suddenly dawned on me that this was actually the Chatelhuic, and that I was being asked to go out and do illustration for the Chatelhuic. And then, of course, halfway through the phone call, I kind of choked up a bit, because it was like, I have to be all serious and professional about this, because this isn't just any Chatelhuic, this is the Chatelhuic. And I think it was that kind of phone call, and it was getting introduced to the Chatelhuic project, that made me realize that I had become an archaeological illustrator, that I was somebody that was actually interested in visualization and how and why we do it and so on. And that switched me. I think that kind of pulled me from being an archaeologist who illustrates to an archaeological illustrator. So that was the start of my career then.
And I didn't use that in my introduction because I know that was one of the topics I wanted to actually explore. But do you still feel comfortable calling yourself an archaeological illustrator? Is that the term that sits best with you?
It is, because it then prompts people to ask, what's that? Because it's not really a term that's used a great deal now, except in the profession. It's not kind of widely used outside of archaeology. So when you talk to people that aren't archaeologists or aren't connected with archaeology, it's a good way of then opening up the discussion. But I think, to be honest, the best archaeological illustrators are archaeologists who illustrate. Because I've always said that you really do need to understand what it is you're drawing. It's a different kind of thing to be an artist or an illustrator who works on archaeological subject matter.
Yeah.
And
that's really interesting. So, and I think, I know that obviously archaeological illustrators are broad church or broad sets of styles, different things they do, from obviously drawing artifacts and reconstructed buildings, or from that technical through to the very versatile and far-ranging styles that you can adopt to actually visualize, reconstruct past scenes from archaeological evidence. Is it really down to, have we exploited the full range, or are we just seeing often the individuals that are best known? We say, oh, that's what archaeological illustration is. I'm interested in that, because you've obviously got a very specific style. I mean, is this representative of what's going on more broadly, or is this about you? I don't know if that makes sense as a pair of questions.
No, that is interesting, because I think it goes back to this kind of problem that the profession has been trying to deal with since the early 90s, I think, in a serious way, but really going as far back as the 80s and the late 70s, which is archaeological illustration a speciality, or is it a professional skill, or is it a set of craft practices? Is illustration something that all archaeologists should know how to do and should do up to publication standard? Or is it something that you really need a professional who's going to specialize and focus exclusively on that area? And I haven't answered that question satisfactorily, and I don't think archaeology really has either, because the process of illustration, whether you're doing artifacts or reconstructions or whatever it happens to be, is actually all about observation. It's all about looking. It doesn't necessarily, the thing that you produce, the artifact illustration or the reconstruction, is actually a consequence of you having looked at the data or the artifact or the interpretations very, very closely, having worked through them and then produced a visualization of that at the end. And so that is crucial to archaeological practice, the ability to be able to do that. And I think sometimes without that kind of end product in mind, the processing doesn't go all the way. I mean, it's the same with publication. You really need to put something down on paper and get it out there and have it peer reviewed and have it assessed in some way. Otherwise, you find that your ideas just kind of become a bit murky and a bit fuzzy, and you never really think them through to a conclusion. And that's why all archaeologists publish their own material, because it's a useful exercise in going from the dirt to somebody going, this is absolutely ridiculous. How can you possibly say this? And that's what it's all about, right? But at the same time, there is an argument to be made that, a lot of archaeologists write very poorly. A lot of archaeologists draw very poorly. And that's okay, because they should really be concentrating on something else. So there is a room for the specialist who, produces a book that they know the public are going to read because it's well written. The specialist who produces an illustration or a painting that they know the public are going to understand because it's well put together. So there is no straightforward answer to that. I think the closest one can get is that we should all treat illustration like we treat publication. It's something that we really should do to see our ideas through. But then once you get to the end, you've excavated some amazing site. Maybe at that point, you should then work with a professional film company or professional documentary company or a professional writer or something to produce something that's going to be more easily and perhaps better consumed by a wider audience. So I think there's room for both.
So, and you've worked in your career in different capacities, presumably. At Çatalhöyük, you had one particular role, and that's evolved with perhaps different projects. You're given more control, more. Is that fair to say? More?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's as flexible as any job is in archaeology. Sometimes even as an excavator, you're asked just to do what you're told, and sometimes you're asked really to be there right from the planning stage all the way through to publication, because the site is small enough, or the excavation is complex in some particular way. So yeah, I mean, I'm just like an excavator in that regard. Some jobs I'll go into and everything is laid out for me, and I just draw the thing and go away again, and I never have much connection to it. And then there are some projects like Çatalhöyük was, for example, where you were integrated into just about every level, from the planning and the decision making to the interpretation to the publication and so on. It varies now, even doing comics. I mean, some projects is just, John, draw what I've told you to draw, and I do the thing. And some of it's I don't really know where to start with this, and so I have to go all the way back to the beginning, to sifting through the data and the information, all the way up to actually running the files down to the printer and picking up the comics in the box.
I mean, it's important for viewers to get a sense of this, that the time of the 1990s and the emergence of, this is not just, Çatalhöyük isn't just any project. I mean, can you give a little bit more of a sense of how you were shaped, or you shaped and it shaped you, and the other things going on in archaeology in the 90s and early noughties that created a climate when the visualization of our stories became so central, or at least more important in our discussions, perhaps not as much as it should be, but
yeah, no, it was kind of an interesting time. I mean, yes, you're right, there was a lot of stuff going on in the 90s that was sort of brought together at Çatalhöyük. I mean, it was the golden age of theoretical archaeology, and it was the time at which theoretical archaeology felt like it had enough gravitas to be able to take on big, important excavation projects and to conduct them according to the theory, which I think you might struggle to get away with nowadays. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but that is a very expensive, very time-consuming proposition. And as we all know, that sort of time and money isn't really available now. It was back then, and people like Ian Hodder took advantage of that, I think. And it was kind of prescient that he did when he did, because that golden age wasn't going to last forever. So visualization was just one of the things that was pulled into that mesh. I mean, there were all sorts of theoretical things being thrown around, some of which were explored and taken apart and transformed, and some of which kind of drifted in and around the periphery. But and so as a consequence, it was an opportunity for me to explore how visualization connected with lots of different things. So not just with digging holes in the ground, which is kind of where through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was assumed that's what archaeological illustration, archaeological visualization was about connecting somehow with the excavation. But I was also given the opportunity to connect with publication in a different way, and to explore different ways of visualizing interpretations as much as visualizing features or skeletons or anything like that. And so it was, I think you also have to bear in mind that I was quite young at the time. This is very much the start of my career, and it was slightly overwhelming. It was a huge project with a lot of people from a lot of different countries, a lot of very, very high-powered thinkers and doers. And so to be churned up in all that meant that by the time I left 10 years later, I don't really felt like I had accomplished very much, but I had certainly been around and had done a lot of things, not all of which I had the time to see through to their obvious conclusion. And I think actually out of that, big, chaotic melting pot of ideas and practices came all the things that pushed me towards comics. So even though I only did some very basic experiments with comics at Chadleigh, it was definitely that experience that has made me think more about the way that image and text and interpretation and data and audience mix together in a way that I don't think would have been possible had I not gone to Chadleigh.
Okay, well, that leads us neatly onto, before we go into the more mortuary specific angle, to discuss this your particular practice of comics and your particular approach to. So tell us about what is your approach? What have you developed that's within this broader range of archaeological illustration?
So I came to comics entirely by accident. I had experimented with all different kinds of media, colored pencils and acrylic paints and pen and ink and all that kind of stuff, and done artifact illustration and done 3D isometric reconstructions of buildings and all the usual sorts of things. And there was a common thread that I found that joined together the sort of the life history of all these illustrations once they left my drawing table. And that was, I had absolutely no control over how they were then connected to the information that had created them. And it was at the time when the internet was kind of really getting going, sort of 96, 97, 98 at Chadleigh, where I began to see my illustrations used completely out of context. And we knew that happened in archaeology. That's not so much that wasn't a revelation necessarily, but it was definitely frustrating to see, an illustration that brought together an awful lot of very contemporary thinking about this really interesting Neolithic site, then used to support an interpretation that was 30 or 40 or 50 years old. And it made me realize that I just couldn't connect the text and the image by simply doing a reconstruction drawing or an artifact illustration.
Okay.
And it was that idea of connecting text and image that first pushed me towards comics. I was sitting there thinking, if only there was a medium in which text and image were inextricably combined, what would that be? Oh, well, that's comics, of course. And it was interesting that I came to that conclusion at about the time that the project was more interested in talking to the local communities that lived around the site, and getting, for example, groups of school children in and showing them around and explaining the archaeology and so on. And Ian said to me, we need something to be able to give the kids when they come, some reconstruction picture or something they can take away. And myself and Sonia Atterley, who was doing some of the ethnography in the villages, both came to the same conclusion, which was a comic would work really well. And so together with a Turkish student who helped us do the translation, Burju Tung, the three of us put together a very early comic, which I've got copies of now. It's really interesting because even in that very early iteration, there were some things which clearly I was interested in doing with comics as a medium. So the archaeologists are in there.
Yeah.
There's a kind of ordinary person's perspective on it. It's not Ian Hodder walking around saying, that's that, and this is that, and that's 3,000 years old, and so on. And there's kind of a spot the artifact kind of thing going on, where there's a drawing in the comic that's clearly kind of referencing the artifact illustrations that we use so often in archaeology, but presenting that in a particular way so that an ordinary reader, a non-archaeologist, can actually understand what that drawing is supposed to mean. It's very crude, but it certainly sets the scene for stuff I did later on. So anyway, having done that, I thought, oh, well, that was neat, and went back to doing other things, and then left the Chadleigh project and started working in the Caribbean, and hadn't really thought about comics all that much in the interim. Got out there and realized that I was facing almost exactly the same public outreach issue, which was that we had an audience on the island who would like to know what we were doing, but just didn't have a sort of a point of contact. The idea of digging in the ground for something that was ancient just really wasn't part of their, everyday kind of educational intellectual vocabulary. And so you had to go right back to basics. And of course, going back to basics really means showing people, not just telling people, but showing people. And so the comic was then an opportunity to show people as well as tell people. So even though people couldn't get out to the site necessarily, I could draw a picture that showed the trench, put some labels on it, have one of the archaeologists talking about it, and then, you know, once again, I was at comics before realizing that that's what I wanted to do. And it was that experience out in the Caribbean. I think I worked on comics for about 6 or 7 years out there, intermittently, not doing it all the time. But by the time I left the Caribbean, I knew that comics worked, that they worked well, and that there was more that I could do with them, and that I needed to learn more about them in order to use them effectively. Now, of course, I was still doing other kinds of archaeological illustrations, still doing reconstruction paintings, still doing artifact illustrations. So it didn't eliminate all these other practices.
Sure.
But and so some of those things do come into the comics. So you'll see artifacts in there, and you'll see reconstruction elements in there, and so comics allowed me to pull in a lot of things that I'd been doing elsewhere and at different times for different kinds of people, and put them all in front of a non-archaeological audience in a way that seemed to work really well.
That's really fascinating. So if I can synopsize this, and then you can tell me I'm wrong, I'm getting a sense from you that firstly, the comic is a medium that is so popularly understood and accessible that it allows community engagement in a way that talking alone, text alone, images alone just cannot do. But simultaneously, and this I'm thinking, as you can imagine, in terms of thinking about both the mass media, but also pseudo archaeology, comics allow you to anchor and control the narrative, not in the sense of, you know, locking it and excluding, you know, non-specialists, but locking it in terms of in relation to the story, so that even having already seen academics themselves abuse those images from almost the get-go. Is that so? Those 2 points, the power of comics, is that a fair synopsis, or are there other points that we've missed?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the points that I made very early on when I was out at Channelhuic in the chapter for Ian's methodology volume was that in order to avoid archaeological interpretation being fixed, you had to come up with a way of constantly refreshing your image. So instead of relying on pictures, reconstruction illustrations, for example, that were 60 years old, you had to create every season a new image of this new interpretation, this new artifact, and so on. Well, that actually becomes I realized later that actually becomes quite difficult, because then what you produce is actually a selection from which people can choose. They can choose their favorite one. So you have, you know, this picture of your Neolithic shrine, and then you have this with a bunch of priests in it, and then this one with a bunch of women in it, and then this one with a bunch of men in it, and then this one with a bunch of children in it. And people can pick the image that they think fits their interpretation best. But what I realize now about comics is that if you're out on a long-term project and you're producing a comic every year, which is essentially almost like a journal of your excavation, then in year one, you might have the archaeologists looking in the trench and saying, well, we think it's this. Then in the second issue, you've got them saying, oh, well, last year we didn't know what we were talking about because we've now excavated this other portion and we now think it's this. Then in year 3, they can say, and now the lab work supports this other theory. And in year 4, then they've got the dating evidence that comes back. So in fact, instead of producing a series of images that people can choose from like a smorgasbord, it's the text image combination in comics will clearly tie your representation of the archaeology to a particular set of available data and available interpretations and so on, which will clearly be seen to be older than the ones that were more recently produced, you know, less complete than the ones that were more recently produced. In other words, that if you do something like that, what you do is you mirror the way that we work as archaeologists. We produce an interpretation based on this small set of data because that's all we have. Yeah. The next year we do something new, we dig a new part of the site and we get some different data and we have a different interpretation and so on. And I think that is one of the things that comics can do, is that it can embed those visualizations of our work, our practice, and our ideas as part of a much longer running story. if you just produce a reconstruction of a burial in the year 2000, it can still be used in the year 2021 to illustrate a completely different set of interpretations, or people can put their own interpretations on it. There's no timestamp on that illustration, apart from maybe kind of stylistically. But in comics, I feel like because the image and the text are inextricably connected, it remains time-stamped.
And that's really interesting. I think that's very important, given that we're going to be heading into mortuary matters, but not just quite yet, because I think I want to just press you on this point, and this may be using language that you're not comfortable with, but is it fair to say, just as to push you, that there's something quite open and honest about comics that allows the practice of what we do to be rendered in a way that perhaps is obscured or can become obscured by technical jargon, by technical language, by text-based media? Or is truth, honesty not the way you would frame it?
Oh, no, yes. No, I think openness and transparency, absolutely, if that's what you want. I have always included the archaeologists as narrators in my comics. So you always see the actual people doing the actual work at the actual site. There's none of this sort of interposing fiction into it, which serves only to cloud the issue. You're not guided through the story of a site by Timmy the time-traveling dolphin. It's always the excavator, it's always the director, it's always the people doing the work. And I think that definitely does create an atmosphere of transparency. And when we get to talking about the NAGPRA projects, of course, that becomes absolutely central, because it's not just that you want to tie your data and interpretations to the person who has the credit for them. You're actually tying it to the person who has responsibility for it. So if you have a museums person saying, this stuff is not, these artifacts in the museum are not related to your tribe, and therefore I am not going to return them, I want that tied to that person because they said that. And in a comic, you can do that by drawing a picture of that person and having those words come out of their mouth in a speech bubble. And it's that sense of responsibility which I think makes comics particularly useful in the context of something like NAGPRA. The same is also true the other way. If you have, ancestral remains or objects of cultural patrimony, and it is only appropriate, given in this particular context, for somebody within the tribe to be speaking for those things, then you can show that, and you can show them assuming that responsibility, but also claiming that voice. So that's something that's actually quite difficult to do in text, because we tend, in academic writing, you tend to kind of fuzzy out the voice. Peters 1973 says, well, Peters 1973 is quite different from a drawing of, Mr. Roger Peters standing there saying this piece of pottery is whatever,
So it centers the practitioners, it centers the debates, the issues, and the locations, and the local people too, who can see them, the actual places. And but then, isn't there? I mean, you mentioned Timmy the time-traveling dolphin. Whether that you just made that up or not, I'm not sure. No, if I say you made that up, then you'll probably say no. Actually, there is, but there should be. But is there a problem here that we tie comics into a sort of childish, patronising, or because every time I go to a certain not every time. Certain heritage sites I go to, comics for me, since childhood, actually, have been a moment of cringe, almost like, oh, do I have to engage with this? Or can I just tell me what date it is, thanks? And because I was such a sad child, from the age of about 10, that was probably the case for most people, but I just want to tell me when it was built and what it is, and when it was knocked down, and what I'm thinking of a castle or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some I've seen recent heritage interpretation where you just like, oh, for crying out loud, we don't need the voice of a fictional character to so I'm not disparaging that. That's just my take, listeners, the readers, viewers, whatever you are. That's just my take. But is there a challenge with comics that it can be tied to that kind of child engagement with fun comic fictional character?
Yeah, there is a real problem with that. But interestingly, that problem is a distinctively British problem.
Okay.
If you go to France, that is not an issue, because the French are very used to having comics that deal with serious adult subject matter, that you read as an adult and that you use in the same way that you use adult literature. The same could be said in Japan, even though it remains a lot of the time looking childish. There's some really serious subject matter discussed in Japanese comics. And certainly when you get into the world of graphic novels and so on, there are an awful lot of adults who almost prefer to get their views on the world from in a graphic package than in a purely text package. And I think it does seem to be a particularly British disease to continually tie comics to the childhood experience of comics, the Dandy and the Beano, or Asterix or whatever. But it doesn't have to be like that. And it's funny that I don't think that audiences really respond to those fictionalized or humorous characters in the way that the designers think they will or thought they will when they put them together. I always struggle to find people who say, oh yeah, I really liked, that fake Roman that they had who toured me around such and such museum. You never really get people responding to it in quite the way as I think the designers intended.
I mean, I wonder whether this is a whole nest of British snobbery class issues that will simultaneously denigrate these media, but then also think that this is the way we patronize people to get them interested, is making it fun. It reminds me of a Mitchell and Webb sketch about the fun historian and having to sort of this kind of how we have to dumb it down to a point where, and it doesn't work, because you end up just trivializing the topics. And this is again very important for mortuary matters, but I just was interested in that particular issue.
And the other kind of big myth, I suppose, that goes along with that is that you have to dumb down, that you can't just simplify. And that's always what I say about comics, is that I want my comics to be able to simplify something that's complicated to the point where everybody can understand it. But that doesn't mean that it's dumbed down. What it means you have to do is you have to explain yourself. So if you're going to use a term like radiocarbon dating, explain it. You can explain the term radiocarbon dating so that anybody can understand it in words of one syllable. And I know that because I've done it. And I've done it to the point where the people that I did it for actually had their comics stolen by other rival companies to show their clients what they did in terms of radiocarbon dating. So, it is an effective, you can effectively simplify without dumbing down.
And this is perhaps a final point before we deal into jump into mortuary matters, but this isn't just about public engagement, is it? This can be used in advocacy. It can be used in proposing a project brief. It can be used in synthesizing a complex published archaeological idea. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the best examples of that are probably outside of archaeology. So when Chrome, the browser, was launched, Chrome, the company, actually engaged a top cartoonist in the US to produce their web developers manual as a comic. Not because web developers are stupid or kids, but which they may, as in they might be young, but because web developing is a highly visual practice, and you need to know where your data is going and why it's blocked at a certain point. I think this was the bit that I saw was all about the way that each tab in Chrome had its own kind of process, so that it wasn't the browser that was functioning as a process. And if you opened up 10 tabs, it would slow the whole thing down. It was just that each tab was like its own separate browser. And I seem to remember that was like a big thing with Chrome. And they explained all this visually in their web development manual, so that everybody can understand it. I mean, the fact that I can tell you now, even in vague terms, what Chrome is meant to do in its browser tabs, having read a comic 10 years ago, I think shows the effectiveness of that. The other illustration is the Annals of Internal Medicine actually used comics fairly early on to illustrate the situations and scenarios for articles about ethics. So the comic was used to tell the story of a particular incident that happened. The nurse fell asleep and somebody had an emergency and they died and so on. And then the article expanded on the ethics within that situation.
Right.
So yes, there was, the comic was a very effective way of telling one part of the academic story, and the text was another way of telling that story or dissecting that story that matched up, that paired with the comic in a really effective way.
So we've come to a point where we understand what you have done and crafted and developed, and the multiple significances of this medium. And this leads us to sort of discuss the mortuary aspect, because of course this is a medium that can be used for discussing genocide, dying processes, disease, mourning, loss. It's not just about the time traveling dolphin being all cheery, and we can deal with every aspect of human emotion and human experience, past and present, through through this medium. So I really wanted, this is what in the Archaeodeath context, I really wanted to press you on is then, what are your thoughts or examples from your past work, or your thoughts about that? How do we use comics, or could use comics, to talk about death, dying, the very experience of mortuary remains, but also then the archaeological practice of excavating and interpreting, say, tombs in churches, right the way back to prehistoric burials. I mean, can you give us some examples or thoughts on how we can use this medium to deal with more sort of, should we say, seemingly topics we wouldn't use this medium for, which I think is a false, that's what we're getting to, is that's not the case.
Yeah, I suppose the first place I would go is back to my work pre-comics and some of the dissatisfaction I had with some of the images that I was being asked to produce of mortuary archaeology. So there were an awful lot of burials at Chatterley, and one of the things that I was asked to do was do those body reconstructions. How did this person look when they were in the grave? And so we did a huge number of those. And I always wondered what the point of them was. These kind of weird, floating in nowhere, people curled up in various positions. It's not like you couldn't get that from the skeleton. So it didn't feel like the reconstructions were actually adding very significantly to the story. And I did go and look at other examples of this sort of illustration, and it's quite widespread. It's used a lot in mortuary archaeology, and it kind of falls under the category of being neat and cool without actually advancing anyone's understanding of the burial or the burial practices or the context for that internment or anything like that in any real way. A lot of them, they're just very unreal kind of illustrations. I don't know that anybody would have actually ever in the past seen that particular scene, because it's always very neat and tidy, and there's very, very rarely people standing around, and very rarely people doing anything. You do get those kind of illustrations, and they're slightly different. They're much more narrative, and I'm not really talking about those. But these just reconstructions of the way the person looked in the grave always seemed to me very, very odd. It was like a tiny little image from a much, much longer story. Yes. And the much, much longer story was what you really wanted to be telling. And you weren't, and you couldn't with that one image. The story couldn't emerge out of that one image. So I remember being frustrated by those. And then I started to do reconstruction pictures of people putting the people into the grave. So, interring the body in some way. And certain people in the project really didn't like that because it was too interpretive. It was not objective enough. And it felt like there was an odd situation here where we could be quite interpretive about the buildings. We could say what we wanted about the buildings, but the moment you started to say anything about the people, it all kind of closed down, and you had to try and be as objective as possible. And that's where these burial reconstructions came in. They were sort of, the body in the grave, disassociated from just about everything else, was an objective visualization. Whereas if you start to put people playing flutes and it being dark inside a building and the flickering light and so on, that was far too weird. And that felt really odd to me, because it felt like the story that we wanted to unravel was the story that I was trying to tell in those other illustrations. You know, what did people do? Why were these burials significant? Why would you put a person and a goat in the same burial? Why would you only just have a head? You know, why was there a bird bone flute in this? I mean, you know, all these questions that the data prompted you, we weren't, or I wasn't allowed to put into the visualizations. And so that those things, I think, although I've not done comics about those kind of burials, if I were to, that's the sort of stuff that I would be focusing on.
Do you feel that? See, this is my. This is where I'm going to rant, and someone's going to see this and get upset. But this is why I have the same problem with facial reconstruction, which is a technique designed for technical purposes, for criminal investigations, you know, to reconstruct how a person's head looked at a particular time of death. But for me, the production of those in heritage context, in archaeological context, sometimes is very evocative, and it has a powerful significance. For me, it's a dead end, because I end up thinking, well, that's a head. That's at one point. You can make it move and animate it, do whatever you want with it, but it's still just a head. And you know, whatever the skin pigmentation debates may be, or the facial hair, or how much it looks just like that famous archaeologist, which they always end up looking like. There's about 3 or 4 options there, but there's no more. You know, or maybe that's me, but anyway, you know, it's a dead end process where we think, wow, we've reconstructed, we've brought the past to life. And I feel that's the same about those artistic reconstructions of the grave. The grave is floating, as you say, and that's that floating thing. You know, you're in an architectural context, for crying out loud there. And even if you weren't, even if it was an open cemetery on a ridge top, in say the Bronze Age or the Roman period, and you want to reconstruct an open air scenario, those individual grave reconstructions are such a I think a cul-de-sac of taking us to a point, and then not revealing process, not revealing context, not revealing sequence or anything. And so I find them a blessing and a curse, as you say. But it's not just the grave context. It's like a lot of other things we seem to do. That's we sort of present and go, da-da, that's the way it was, folks. And you go, well, what? That he had a beard? Well, I could have guessed that. You know, my imagination is limited, but I can imagine some people. I've seen people who have beards and then don't have beards. I know they change. That doesn't really change the world for me. I want to know about that context of architecture and landscape and time. You know, how these, because I mean, these buildings surely are, you know, the whole point is surely that they're going in and out of different ritual and domestic uses, and then a funeral's taking place, or they're retrieving a bit of body or something. Wow, the potential there. It's really sad to see how, I'm not having to go at Châteauhurt, but how we often miss the versatile ways we can do these kind of reconstructions.
It's kind of an unwillingness to grapple, not necessarily with visualization, but with the idea of story.
Yeah.
So that if you're going to present a story, the beginning, the middle, and the end have to be the same, as in they have to be of the same quality of truthfulness or quality of factuality or something. That you can't have a story that starts with, well, this might have been, and then a middle bit which is, oh yes, we know all about this. This is all very certain. And then an end which is, so there we are. It might all change tomorrow when we go back and do some more excavation. And I think it's a nervousness about telling a story that has those kind of up and downs. And I think part of that is because it's difficult for people to understand how you can tell a visual story and yet have it be uncertain at various points. Yeah. And that's why I put the archaeologists into these comics, because they're the ones that can come in and say, now it's absolutely certain that this stone is lying here. However, it's quite uncertain as to why this stone is lying here. You know, and that they can actually talk you through, or talk the reader through, the points at which they are concerned about things, or, you know, sorry, that they are certain about things or uncertain about things, and so on. And in a comic I did recently, I actually had a little sort of break in the story where the archaeologist was saying, well, I've got 3 options here. I don't know which one I'm going to do. And then he talks through each one of the options and says, well, I can't do this because it's raining. I can't do this because I don't have enough time or money. So I'm going to have to do this one. And it felt like for the first time, I was drawing, or I was illustrating or referencing the actual on the ground process that shapes the reasons why we do various things. And it's rare to see that. And it would be lovely to see people, you know, excavate in a comic, excavating a burial and then saying, you know, I haven't got time to do this, or it's been chopped away by the JCB, or, you know, to kind of illustrate the limitations sometimes that we have to work around or that we have to face.
And so part of this is also interpretive options, because so much of burial archaeology is we don't understand, even if we have a sequence and we have a final deposit, which doesn't always happen. We don't always have at the deposit moment, do we? We may have the discard and the, you know, the recuts and the disturbed sequences, and we don't. You know, but let's say we have a deposit. Even if we have that, we have multiple scenarios of motivation and do you feel there are examples where people have done that for burial archaeology? Because I can't think of many where people have tried to visualize these options of how the person may have been treated.
No, and again, it's difficult with static images, so with paintings and drawings, to put them into a sequence and to make sure that that sequence is then how the illustrations are reproduced. And that, again, is one of the things that comics will do, is that it will have a sequence over a page or over a series of pages that you can't unpick, or it's much more difficult to unpick. And so therefore you can say, you know, here's what we found, here's option A, here's option B, here's option C, all in 3 panels underneath the illustration of what you found. And then it's much more difficult for people to kind of crop it so that it's only option A or only option B or whatever. Yeah.
Because I think that, I mean, if you think of any, I mean, in my period of interest in sort of early medieval burial archaeology, you know, and I've had a bit of attempts to write about some of these issues, but, you know, some of these really rich, famous, just, you know, discussed burials such as the Prittlewell Prince now and the Sutton Hoo Mound 1 ship burial, you know, we have the standard archaeological reconstructions of what happened at the funeral, but, you know, the data there is crying out. There was no single what happened at the funeral. There could never have been a single person who saw it all. There was no grandstand perspective ever. You can't imagine. No one had a stage. I mean, our modern sort of a sense of it. Who could have watched that funeral? And even if you look at big grand funerals today, you know, you need 15 television cameras and a helicopter to watch the funeral. And if you're on the ground, unless you're actually the corpse itself, which is another perspective one can take in art, of course, is the perspective of the dead person themselves. You know, but, you know, of the perspective of the person, you can't capture that event. You know, thinking about a modern state funeral or modern major. But then if you think of smaller scales, that applies too. If you're looking at a death of a child or death of a, you know, perhaps only a couple of people know, but still it involved multiple places, multiple actors, living actors, multiple material cultures, structures. And it's such a waste, because that's exactly the kind of story that we as mortuary archaeologists are you know, fixated on trying to untangle, both for other academic audiences and public audiences. It seems that comics are a really missed opportunity for this. Sorry, I'm just ranting at you now, but you know, or the audience.
Indeed, and actually this kind of leads me on to something that I'm a bit concerned with at the moment, is that I'm, as far as I know, really one of the only people doing this. And while that's great, my work order book is full and my drawing table is full, and that's lovely. But in fact, there are more comics out there than I can make in my remaining work life. I mean, it's just not possible for me to do every comic that I think should be done. And so part of what I'm concerned about is that is whether or not archaeology departments in particular view public outreach as important enough to be training students while they're undergraduates and then on into their postgraduate career in exactly the kind of techniques that are necessary to be able to do this work professionally. So this kind of rolls back to what I was saying about archaeological illustration as a craft. It would be great if every master's student or PhD student was able to put their work into the form of a comic. It doesn't have to be, you know, professional level or anything like that, but to at least be able to visualize and to create a meaningful story out of what they're researching, because it's a way not just of presenting it, but of thinking it through in a very particular way. Coming to that point, for example, like you were suggesting, where there's a gap. There's a gap in their understanding of this particular burial, for example. What did it mean beyond the fact that the body lay like this and that, you know, he may or may not have had a beard? You know, beyond that, what is the visual context of the the occasion or the ceremony or the wider social meaning of this at the time. But then also, how does that resonate down to the present day? Obviously, I was just at Wrexham Cemetery looking at Watts Dyke and sent you the email about but those graves dug at the time, I actually stood there and tried to work out which ones were there and which ones weren't there in May of 1891, when the grave that I was interested in was being dug and being used. And you have a very different sense of that little corner of the cemetery once you take out the ones from 1900 and 1914 and 1917. And indeed, the other side of the graveyard, which, as you pointed out, wasn't even in use yet. It was all just fields. It's a very different place from the sort of pseudo-Gothic, emo, atmospheric, Victorian thing that you get nowadays when you go around that little corner. And having the capacity or the confidence to do that as a postgraduate researcher would, I think, vastly improve your work.
So mortuary archaeology, well, all archaeology needs comics. Mortuary archaeology, I think, is specifically needs comics. I mean, I'm aware of a few general comments on archaeological illustration linked to mortuary topics. And, I haven't seen, and I've seen some fantastic grave scenes and some fantastic art about, mortuary archaeology, or, not only the funerals, but then, this is what they would have worn, which is a problem in itself. But assuming that person actually wore all that stuff, or had all that stuff, which I think is a massive ask. But let's imagine then there's some wonderful reconstructions of this is the Saxon chieftain, or this is the warrior woman, and how they would have looked if they had all those things. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of, I think, dishonesty and conceit in that process, which I'm not blaming the artists for, but I'm blaming us as a discipline for not. And comics could be just one of the ways in which we break down those conceits and those rhetorics and honestly share some of the alternative stories.
To put the researcher into the research. So while they're telling the story of this Anglo-Saxon burial, they are actually there as a character, saying what they think they know about the burial, and then expressing any concerns or pointing out any gaps, or in the interpretation that is visualized right in front of them, that they are part of. So that again is something that I think static illustrations in museums on interpretation boards just can't do. You can't really stick the illustrator or the archaeologist into that wonderful painting of the Anglo-Saxon burial. It just isn't visually appropriate. But with a comic, it can be.
Do you think this is a bit of a tall order? I mean, since the 60s and 70s, Lewis Binford et al., the nemesis of Hodder that we mentioned earlier, so I have to put him in there, been talking about the need to create a dynamic a story from a static archaeological record. And whatever the differences of theoretical approach of the post-processual schools and their successors, is there a point to say that we are, for mortuary archaeology or archaeology more generally, we're going to continue to fail if all we're doing is using a text-based medium to have these debates? Because whether it's comics or other styles of communication, I don't think that we're getting the story across. I mean, in terms of both academic debate and interpretation, and then public engagement with these mortuary remains.
No, I agree, and I think one of the biggest difficulties we've had since the 2000s is this idea that somehow the internet or digital presentation is the same thing as a comic. And it isn't really. It still maintains that separation of text and image to a large degree. Yes, you have various kinds of media like video, where spoken, speech and moving image are brought together. But it's not something that can be held in the hand or looked at and replayed up and down across the page in the same way that a comic can. Even a short video, it's quite disruptive to go back 3 seconds or to go forward 5 seconds and so on. Whereas in a comic, you can do that just with a flick of the eye. And the effect that gives you as a reader or a consumer is that you're able to much more effectively, I think, overlay different parts of the story on top of each other. So that you might have on a single comics page the story of the excavation, the story of what happened in the Anglo-Saxon period, and the story of the excavator talking about both of those things. And that as a reader, you can flick your eye up and down and merge all those three things together. Whereas even on a short video, if you want to do that, you've got to be constantly going back and forth and back and forth. And I think that disrupts the effect that you otherwise get with a comics page. So I think there are affordances in comics that we haven't even really begun to explore properly in terms of building a comprehensible picture of some of the research that we do.
Well, this leads us into, because I think there is a lot of, I mean, perhaps viewers will contradict us or drop into the comments some examples we don't know about, both of comics and other visual materials they think work particularly well in dealing with mortuary subjects. And that's, honestly, we don't have an exclusive knowledge on this. You know, this is our impressions as two people in conversation. But, you know, but having said that, you know, one of the areas which I'm also aware you've been working on that has, I think, begun to do this, you know, is your NAGPRA work, with where it's not so much the field work, it's the opposite, isn't it? You know, it's not the field work that's the focus of interest and what we say about the human past through comics, but what we do with the legacies of these collections in museums and so on. So could you talk a little bit about what you've been doing there?
Yeah. So this is an interesting spin-off, I think, particularly of comics, and particularly of the history of my working with comics. So in 2013, I was at the SAA conference, and I happened to bump into Sonia Atterley, whom I hadn't seen since I had been at Chattal. I think 2007 was the last time we saw each other, and we said hello and how nice it was to see each other again. And, you know, she was busy and I was busy, and we said, oh, we must get together and do something at some point. You know, we really should work together again. Anyway, nice to see you. Bye-bye. So another couple of years went along, and I was doing some illustration work for a museum in Oklahoma to do with the molding of gold frog shaped beads from Mexico. And the person who was writing this article had a particular idea about the sequence for how these things were produced, and he wanted my help in essentially creating a comic about them. Not a comic that looked like a comic, but a series of phase diagrams, process diagrams. And so we talked this all through and produced the illustration, and it worked really well, and you could see exactly how these gold things were made. And in the course of our conversation, he said, oh, I've, you know, here at the museum, we've got, I'm sorry, I've been busy. We've been dealing with a lot of NAGPRA repatriation stuff. And I didn't really know what NAGPRA was, apart from, you know, the definition of it. I'd heard about it at university because they'd only just come in at the time. And he said, I'm a little bit lost with some of this stuff. I wish I had some advice for how I can talk about this to the public, the people that come to the museum. And I thought, well, I know Sonia Atterley has a Native American background. I'll just drop her an email and see whether she's interested, or whether she has any advice, rather. So I emailed her, and she said how nice it was to hear from you again. She said, yes, she does have a lot of experience with this because she was on the NAGPRA National Review Committee. So I put the two of them in touch, and they had a sort of a back and forth, and decided that it was better for him to go down some other route. So he went off and did his thing. But then Sonia said, you know, I've been thinking about the two of us working together, and I've got this idea about trying to come up with some kind of visualization for what we do with NAGPRA. And I said, well, I was trying to sell this other guy on the idea of doing a comic. And she said, that's what I was looking for. So we kind of both hit on the comics idea at about the same time. And she was working with Jen Shannon at the University of Colorado on some project that was kind of a spin-off of a NAGPRA repatriation that Sonia had worked on with the Peabody Museum and the University of Michigan. And one thing kind of led to another. And as they were telling me this story, and as I was sort of getting to grips with the material, so the comic kind of wrote itself, because it was the best way to tell the story, was to have the visuals and the text all wrapped into one. And so the first comic that we did was about a repatriation case at the University of Michigan, where the university had initially been very resistant to the idea of returning anything from their collection. And then it had kind of all boiled over into a bit of a protest and activism from the Native American community, and then the university had kind of stopped and said, we need to reconsider this, and they got somebody from the tribe in to speak to them, who gave a very powerful speech about why this was important to the community. And the university just said, you know what, you're absolutely right. We were wrong and we should do this differently. And they completely changed the way that they did NAGPRA related requests and repatriations and so on. And in doing so, have actually created an entirely new model for working with Native American communities, a really successful one that as far as I know, everybody on all sides of the situation, the museum, the tribe, the administration, are extremely happy with, and which appears to be a model now for the way that other institutions should not only approach doing this, but also approach holding their hands up and saying, you know what, we haven't done this right in the past. So that was a really interesting story to tell. And as soon as the comic went out, we took it to Indigenous Comic-Con. We gave copies to the tribe to sell. Other tribes started getting in touch with us and saying, we have repatriation stories and we would like to tell them as well. And we're now sort of creating a series of these comics. And the way that we've framed it is that each comic deals with a particular aspect of NAGPRA law, or a particular situation, a particular common NAGPRA situation. And so we tell the legal detail and explain the procedural stuff through the lens of this particular tribe's experience or particular museum's experience.
See, that's really interesting, and it's as you say, not wishing to diminish what you've done at all, but the possibilities are endless moving forward with that. The potential of, taking that model to different, indigenous versus or in relation to museum situations, but also all sorts of other protests and debates. It's wonderful, but it's only the beginning, and it's not just your work. It's about how we encourage this to be a more common solution or approach to communicating issues between in public archaeology and in archaeological research.
I think there's something very interesting about comics as a medium when used with these sorts of scenarios, in that they seem to genuinely create a middle space, a third voice that emerges out of two different points of view, or this idea of a conflict, or this idea of it's not a compromise. It's not like, so we couldn't do this and we couldn't do that, so we had to do the third thing. It's that the story itself is almost non-conclusive in a way, which allows, I think it allows people to see both sides without necessarily having to agree with them in a funny sort of way, but at least being sympathetic to it. And again, this is one of the reasons why I want other people to get involved in this, because I don't know how much I can explore this on my own. I think it needs other creative minds bringing into these sorts of situations. But those can't just be, we can't just hire a bunch of comics people from Marvel. We have to kind of bring these people up through archaeology and through anthropology and through museum studies, and get them to think about the way in which they would tell these kind of stories in this sort of way.
And that leads me to another question, which is, one of the great challenges, I think, of mortuary archaeology has been, of course, the visualization of the dead and the sensitivity, not only the remains themselves, which are one thing, right, but particularly with digital communication, but with also any kind of publication, whether it's magazines, whether it's actually the academic articles, the presence of the dead can be problematic and difficult in multiple regards.
Mm-hmm.
They can fix and almost fetishize those remains, whether it's just showing the skeleton in the grave as discovered, or a reconstruction. But I'm saying this not to you know this, but it's more for viewers who may not know. But then also, I think there's another challenge that certain traditions of archaeological work have refused to respect Indigenous rights, have rightly reacted against that. And in most of the Americas, you cannot publish not simply the skeletal material, but even the grave plans and the site plans. And so you end up with American antiquity filled with really exciting research, but with perhaps one table and one site location distribution map to explain a really rich mortuary culture. And we then wonder why global audiences are perhaps not reading or engaging with that material, because it's boring. It looks boring. It's written by a very eminent bioarchaeologist and that's one of the things I really have trouble with It's not my limitations of understanding of the material, but and I understand why we're in this scenario. Don't get me wrong, I understand. But from a British perspective, where has its own problems with the dead are poured onto every archaeological magazine. New excavation Roman cemetery, there's the archaeologist digging a skeleton, there's a skeleton, there's somebody in the lab with the skeletons, and obviously the academic publication won't be quite so visual, but there's still the dead are at least present. Now that has problems with it, but at least it doesn't face the problem of absence, and that the silencing or the almost sense of concealment through respect, yes, but also I just wondered. So that was my rant. Here's my question coming from that. Has the potential of comics and other artistic media been fulfilled in filling that bridge to create the third space, or not? Do you think in the Americas in particular?
Well, I can only speak from my work,
Okay.
from the point of view of my work, and actually the answer to that is very definitely yes. And I think there's kind of two. Well, there's a thread and an example. The thread is, I think, that we need as archaeologists, I think, to understand that what we do is actually as interesting to people as what we find. Yes. So the practice and process of archaeology, the kind of, it's almost like the whodunit or the murder mystery type approach people find that really interesting, really, really intriguing. It was, if you remember, it was actually the thing that drove Time Team.
Yes.
It wasn't, they didn't just lay out a whole bunch of potsherds and say, woohoo, here's all what we found. It was the, oh my God, what's happening in Trench 2? What's happening? Join us tomorrow to see what we managed to find. Is it all, has it all been for nothing? And it was that kind of Agatha Christie or Poirot type plot arc to Time Team that people found really interesting. And the NAGPRA comics, that's what we follow. It's the story of how this stuff is, how it ended up in museum collections, who identified it, and how it then made its way back, and the impact that it had. It doesn't actually focus on the human remains or the objects themselves necessarily, because in fact, that's not really the focus of the story. So that's the thread. And that I think is something that archaeologists find difficult to understand, because they are so obsessed with the objects, so obsessed with the little bits and pieces. Those little bits and pieces, of course, are important, but they are only important insofar as they lead to this other bigger story. So that's like I say, the thread that I think should perhaps be explored more in mortuary archaeology. And the second thing is that the second NAGPRA comic, which hasn't come out yet because it's still in community review, which has been delayed because of the pandemic, but the second comic dealt with the story of the return of some very sensitive items from a very important institution in the US, and involved people at the highest level of government. And so it is a very, very interesting story. But the objects themselves were what it was that was returned was so sensitive that it was not going to be possible for me to show it in the comic. And it was not going to be possible for me to, and I didn't want to not show it, because of course the whole point of the story is about the absence of these things. Like, the tribe did not have them and the tribe wanted them back. So to simply expunge the thing from the story, or to put a big black redacted mark over it, as I have seen on some photographs and video pertaining to this story, it was also not appropriate, because you don't want to emphasize the loss of this thing anymore. You're actually talking about its return and its re-presence within the community. So I had to come up with a way of drawing something without drawing it, to show something without showing it. And after some thinking and some talking with the tribe, I did come up with a way. I can't tell you about it because it's still in community review. But the whole point about comics is that it is possible. So did you ever read Doonesbury, Gary Trudeau's American political strip? It's run for years and years and years. And it's notable for him deciding at various stages not to draw various presidents or vice presidents of the US because for various reasons. And so he used to come up with a little floating glyph for these people, which would behave and interact with the other fully drawn characters as if it were a real person. So like an asterisk or a Roman helmet or something like that. And it never occurred, I don't think, to any reader to say, oh my God, this has gone, this is ridiculous. I'm not reading this comic anymore because there's a floating helmet instead of a proper representation of George Bush. And that's what comics can do. They can mix in various types of graphic working, whether it's realistic representation or abstract or impressionistic or whatever, in a way that still makes sense to people. So I can have an archaeologist standing there talking over a map like they're giving a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, and then in the next panel actually being there in the Near East or wherever it is. And nobody thinks, well, did he get on a plane? How did he get there? You know what I mean? You can do that in comics, and that's kind of a silly example, but nobody sits there and questions why you didn't draw them getting on a plane and flying to this land, flying to this far off country. In the same way, I can show you that something is being discussed without necessarily showing the detail of it that would be, offensive or not appropriate.
So in some ways, it's true of so many other things that the showing of the thing that you actually outraged about, or upset or sensitive, or the performance of its redaction are perhaps the laziest and easiest, but trying to creatively think of ways of presencing those issues and debates that allows people to have the conversation is the most challenging and but ultimately the most profitable route.
Indeed, that's kind of the whole story of NAGPRA, really, which is it's not about who does or does not have the thing. It's about power. It's about what the presence or absence of these things do to the communities that they either have them or don't have them. And when people talk about, well, it's all about the pottery that we'll lose from this museum and we won't be able to study, they're ignoring the real issue, which is the loss that has a huge impact and still continues to have a huge impact in the communities who are simply denied access to these things or denied control over these things.
And I have to ask in this context about this community review process, because these are topics where, again, it's a piece of rhetoric and a piece of insulting rhetoric to assume that these indigenous communities are a single voice, a single perspective. I mean, it sounds like that's a really important part of the whole thing is sharing it beyond just the one person who you talk to who is representative of this tribal grouping, to actually get different perspectives on what you've produced. Is that fair?
It is absolutely. And in fact, we came up with a completely new terminology for this kind of comic, which I'm launching on the world for the first time because the article hasn't been published yet. But we're calling them community engaged comics, which really is less about, I think in the beginning we had this idea that the comics were collaborative, that the archaeologists and the scientists and the artists and the community people would all sit down and they would collaborate on making the comic. But in fact, what happened was that there was a very particular kind of back and forth that not only changed the way the story was written or the way the story was drawn, but actually changed the very nature of the story itself. And so what we thought we were going into the community to do on their behalf actually turned out to not at all be what we ended up doing. And that is, it's kind of difficult to explain, but when you sit through it, you realize how different it is from simply a simple sort of client illustrator relationship. I mean, I have a project coming up with the museum in New York, and the woman there, she and I get on very well, and we will certainly collaborate over the comic. But there is no sense that in doing so, that this process will have a profound impact on either her way of looking at the material, my way of looking at the material, or indeed the story that we come up with. You know, this is very definitely a client-illustrator relationship, and we're producing a particular piece of informational output. But when you work with a community, the whole it's almost like you don't know what the end product is. You're just working together, and you'll see what comes out at the other end. And so the community review process is not just handing the product back to the tribal historian and saying, would you check this for factual accuracy? It's actually about going back through everybody that was part of this process and saying, is this where you thought we would end up? And if not, why not? I don't know necessarily that this is part of an editorial process. I don't think it's, oh, I would like the color of my hat changed, or I would like, you know, this to be a horse instead of a bison. I don't think it's necessarily that kind of editorial process. I think it's more about it being the final part of the conversation as everybody gets to read and look through the finished work, not just on their own, but in family groups and in whatever groupings that they originally came to the project in. And that's why it's taken so long over the past year, because of course those meetings have not been easy or indeed possible for a lot of communities. So the comic has kind of stalled somewhere along the review process, and Jen's going up there later in the year once it's safe to do so, and hopefully she'll be able to get together and they can kind of finish whatever reviewing needs to be done, and we can get the comic out later this year.
Well, this hasn't just been a process of stalling because of a pandemic lockdown. This has been, I mean, the pandemic has crippled some Native American communities. I don't know if this applies in this area, but I mean, it's been absolutely, seeing some of the stories of the scale, it's been absolutely horrific.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the other thing too is that this isn't just an inconvenience, that this is, you know, that people have died. And so, you know, the community needs to address those things. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the story that we're telling is kind of about death, is about death and rebirth and so on. And it's a difficult conversation to have at a time when elders are dying in their hundreds. And you know, I mean, the community is in a state of fracture at the moment. And it's not just that this is not as important as what's going on. It's that actually talking about this case is particularly difficult at a time like this. And
at a time when more than ever, we're being asked to produce things rapidly, and this digital world demands, we are sometimes our own worst enemies in demanding immediate results. This is a process that takes time. It's about conversations in the production of the comic, about conversations about process. It's a process about process. So I mean, it does make me wonder whether, you know, people fully, it's not simply about understanding the medium, but respecting the labor, the emotional, the practical labor that goes into the production of what may be only a few frames. And certainly my humble efforts of discussing things with you have been beautifully straightforward in my perspective, but of course it all takes time. It all takes time that is not, you know, it's not the same. It's not the same as sitting in a room and writing on your own. I mean, that's hard enough for many people, including myself. And but yeah, I mean, it's a complex process and dealing with such profound issues for communities, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's why we felt like we needed to come up with a different term for it, because otherwise, if it was just described in a kind of client-based way, you want to know why it took you 3 years to produce this comic. After all, it's only 28 pages. I mean, how much time could it possibly take? But the truth is that it's not about the drawing, and it's not even necessarily about the writing. It's about the conversations out of which those two things emerge. And these conversations actually are not conversations that have happened in this way before. So it will take time.
And that's the thing I find so ironic amongst many academic commentators who in the one voice will talk about and celebrate collaboration and how it's important to collaborate with others, and yet simultaneously see peer review, see editorial process, see dialogue as just an impedance in their ideas miraculously appearing in print so they can move on to the next thing. And I think that, you know, if we're going to embrace collaborative work within and beyond specialists, whether it's involving art or not. We have to respect that this takes time. Stuff, whole fieldwork projects take decades, not just because this cliche of one academic sitting on the results, which I see paraded again and again. Yes, that can happen, but usually because of time and money, illness, circumstances, but because it involves collaboration. Either we respect that and give that time as scholars, or we don't bother. And I think that's the problem I find really frustrating with this demands on us. Yeah, it's great that we had a collaborative project, and here next week, here is the results. And you get, I'm really not sure how much collaboration actually must have gone into that. Whether it's working with indigenous communities or working with a local school, was that really just rocking up, going, "Here, kids, here's what I've done. Thank you. Bye." Did you enjoy it? Tick a box. Thank you.
I absolutely agree. And I felt a little bit the Oswestry Heritage Comics, when I was asked to sort of wrap up the findings from it, it felt like actually the collaboration had only just begun. Like the comics were the starting point for whatever collaboration I was doing onwards. And it certainly feels like that now. Whereas I think HLF were like, well, how did you collaborate? Yeah. And on paper, well, we did a comic together, doesn't look as good as we did a comic together and we meet each other every week and have coffee. And now we're working on this together and we're doing that and we're doing the next thing. But this is like years beyond the end, beyond your cutoff date for reporting to you. It is. It's that insensitivity to the idea that different partners, collaborative partners, are going to have different timetables and different things going on. In fact, it would be interesting to do a comic about a collaborative project and show all the things that other people are having to deal with apart from your little archaeology thing. It's like the kids got sick and the house burned down and, the cat died and all the rest of it. Well, those things take time out from, oh, yes, and let's go off and talk about Watts Dyke and what it means to the community.
Well, indeed. Perhaps we should just, I've avidly avoided Oswestry Heritage Comics and borderland issues because maybe that's a future conversation that deserves its own separate time. But it would be crazy not to mention explicitly that as well as producing his own collection of Oswestry Heritage Comics as part of a project, focusing on Oswestry's natural and historic archaeological heritage, whatever wrap up label, whatever, everything from rail enthusiasts to hill forts and newts, of course, and the story of the region and its meaning to people. And you have published this. I was very pleased that actually a book 2 years ago I did, just I can waft, you see, John actually produced a comic, an article in the form of a comic about his work. But also complemented that in 2019 in our first open access Offa's Dyke journal. John has a wonderful paper about the Oswestry Heritage Comics and his work, which, a surprise, it includes examples of the Oswestry Heritage Comics and and discusses them and the actual process of putting them together, and also another level of honest, sort of discussing the process is that we have published a paper together about our ongoing project that isn't finished yet. In last year's, envisioning Watts Dyke, we're putting together a Watts Dyke heritage comic trail. I don't know exactly the term we've finally, I don't know what we called it in here. I keep changing it in my mind what we call it, but it's the Watts Dyke, through Wrexham. Hey, and here
as we speak.
And we're doing the panels and it's very exciting and fun, and watch this space for the results. But we published a discussion of the problem and the process. And I think that was in the book, Public Archaeology's Frontiers and Borderlands, which is open access through Archaeopress. So, there's a whole other conversation to be had about borderlands and monuments and landscape and community that John could regale us with for another couple of hours. But I'm so delighted to have had the chance to talk to John about the particular mortuary dimensions, because I think that's so important. I think it's NAGPRA work, the challenge of getting beyond the static, burial context in our artwork. These, I think, are going to be ongoing conversations, and I'm aware of publications by others coming out on this issue. And I think there is slowly a broader conversation between archaeologists and heritage professionals and archaeological illustrators happening. But I think John was there first, and I think it's really important to credit his ongoing work on multiple regards in that mortuary archaeology debate. Even though he's not primarily a mortuary archaeologist, that's not the point. But I think his art art and his comics are really an important part of what we're going to be doing as a community of researchers if we're going to take this medium forward. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you, John. But is there any final thoughts you have for us about comics and your work that you want us to take away?
I think, to be absolutely honest, I would like everybody watching this to try and make comics. I think it's not an exclusive medium. I learned how to do it. I wasn't taught how to do it. I learned by reading comics and doing my own. But it's the ability to take the story that you are involved in and translate it into a visual medium. I just think it's a really important skill that a lot of more archaeologists should have.
Well, as John has experienced the pain of trying to map my stick figures onto to make them into real art, he understands the yawning gap. And if he has any faith in me, then he should have faith in the rest of us. We can all have a go. So I think I take that personally as a responsibility. I'm going to try, even with my limited artistic skills. So everybody watching this should have a go too. Thank you so much, John, and I will hope to have you back at some other point to talk about Borderlands, and I'm sure Death will come into that, particularly with the cemetery in Wrexham that we're trying to visualize, but about other matters too. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.